Recording started. Carl, recording started?
Yes.
Okay. Welcome everyone. On behalf of the Board of Directors of ICHRRF, I invite all our audience to yet another lecture, distinguished lecture in the ICHRRF series called Speaking Up series. My name is Dr. Adityanji. I am the President and Chairperson Board of Directors of the ICHRRF. We are a human rights organization that takes up the causes of persecuted minorities worldwide. And I again welcome all our audience for this special lecture under the auspices of Speaking Up series. A little bit about ICHRRF, International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom, is a US-based nonprofit organization focused on upholding human rights and religious freedom through continuous monitoring, policy intervention, and collaboration. We are focused on educational, research, legal, and human rights advocacy and charitable purposes, and strive to be an advocate for human rights and religious freedoms of underrepresented communities across the world. We do believe that humankind can no longer afford to selectively be vocal about the rights of only a specific set of people. A humane and just world necessitates fair treatment for all living beings. Our focus is on indigenous rights and freedom, free speech, and their cultural preservation. Some of our initiatives include monitoring violations of the freedoms and sanctity of religious and philosophical minorities across the world, research into documentation of the culture, history, challenges faced by such communities, policy recommendations on human rights, religious diversity, and pluralism to international organizations, agencies, national and local governments, collaborations to support the cultural and philosophical diversity across the world. I may add here that International Commission for Human Rights was an active participant in October 2021 World Parliament of Religions, where we presented a panel discussion with multiple speakers on indigenous religions and traditional philosophical communities. This is available with World Parliament of Religions for next 30 days. This is our logo. And we come to our today's distinguished lecture under the Speaking Up series. The topic of today's lecture is politically sponsored persecution and ethnic cleansing of Indo-Caribbeans in post-independence Guyana. Our distinguished speaker for today is Mr. Ravindra Dev. I will give a little bit of introduction to the topic. Guyana is a country of immigrants like United States. Everyone who is in Guyana is an immigrant to that country. Indo-Guyanese or Indo-Caribbeans or Indian Guyanese are people of Indian origin who are now born and bred citizens of Guyana who trace their ancestry to Indian subcontinent. They are colloquially called Girmitiya or Jahajis because they took a jahaj or a ship to come from India, sailing across the seas to Guyana. They are descendants of indentured laborers who were brought by colonialist power from India beginning in 1838 during the time of British Raj. This journey of indentured laborers continued by the British colonialists till 1918. And now we have fourth and fifth and sixth generations of these indentured laborers who are currently in Guyana. I'm not going to, quote unquote, steal the show from our distinguished speaker. He will, speak about the problems of Guyana and Indo-Caribbeans in detail. So you will see our distinguished speaker, Mr. Ravindra Dev, that's his picture. He's a fourth generation indentured laborer. He had a BSc in economics. He studied in United States. He is an attorney, JD. He got his JD degree, and he's member of New York State Bar. He worked as a corporate executive in New York City for a period of 15 years from 1975 to 1990. He returned back to Guyana in 1991 as a community activist. He formed an organization called ROAR, Rise, Organize and Rally, a Guyanese movement in 2000s after the anti-Indo-Caribbean riots in that country. Mr. Ravindra Dev was elected to Guyanese Parliament from 2001 to 2006. He has been a newspaper columnist since 1989. He has been a media consultant for Guyana Times Media Group, and he's an Indo-Caribbean organizer. Before I give the floor to Mr. Dev, there are some ICHRRF housekeeping rules for this presentation. I would like all the audience to keep themselves muted in order to avoid noise interference. I would like folks to change their cell phone setting to vibration mode so that there are no unexpected call during the lecture. We would not like anyone to interrupt our esteemed speaker while he's speaking. Let him speak. If you have a question, you will get opportunity to ask the question at the end of the presentation. Only those members of the audience who identify themselves openly will be allowed to pose questions. So no anonymous questioners, please. If anyone is joining anonymously, we will not allow you to ask questions. Please send all your questions through the chat function or through Q&A function. If you are asking a question, please be precise and specific in asking a question. I do not encourage people to write a monologue in the chat function in the garb of a question. Question has to be very specific. We are recording this event and it will be available to everyone on our YouTube channel within 24 hours. And once that happens, we will post it for everyone to view. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And now it is for Mr. Ravi Dev. Welcome to the International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom. The floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you, Dr. G. And namaskar, everyone. It's a very small group of which I know almost everyone, so it's like speaking to family. So I'd like to apologize ahead of time that my presentation was prepared a bit academically because I felt there might be some of individuals from those quarters that may want to look in depth on the question that we have put on the table here. Politically sponsored persecution, ethnic cleansing of Indo-Caribbeans in the post-independent Guyana. Now, while I've been asked to speak about a topic, I will be focusing on the systemic conditions behind the phenomenon so that parallels can be drawn and applied to other countries, both into which Girmitiyas were sent during the 19th and 20th century, and some of the insights may be applicable to what is unfolding in Bangladesh or any other Hindu minority countries where violence has been inflicted on them and is being inflicted on them. We heard about Girmitiya, coming from the word agreements pronounced by the Bhojpuri as Girmit. But what is unique about this Girmit is that it represents a transition from slave labor. The British had slavery before it introduced this form of labor. So it's a transition arrangement between slave labor into what we today call a free labor regime in which we all function today. And it's very important for us to note this because, again, what was unique about this contract, and is significant for our present discussion, is that there were criminal penalties for its violation. Even though it was a civil contract, there were criminal penalties. Incarceration and onerous fines were the penalties. And these were decided on by magistrates who invariably were sympathetic to the planters. So from the word go, the Girmitiyas had the deck stacked against them. However, when the planters grossly violated their side of the contract, the Girmitiyas would and did strike in protest. But these would be defined by the planters as riots. The Guyana police force would be summoned, the Riot Act would be read, and the police would fire into the crowd of striking workers. In Guyana, for instance, there were hundreds of strikes across the sugar plantations, and workers, Girmitiya workers, were killed in 1872, as early as that, 1896, 1903, 1912, 1924, and 1939 and 1948. The same occurred in Fiji and South Africa. And we must note that the police, supposedly a state institution, was at the beck and call of the planters. The violence of what they called the leaden argument, the bullets made of lead, the leaden argument, as they smirkingly called it, was always available to both the state and the planters against Girmitiyas. And that is why it's important for us to know about it. Since this violence, this leaden argument was applied by the Guyana police force, let's take a look at it. And it was founded right after the end of slavery in 1839, just a decade after the London Police Metropolitan Force, the first in the world. But interestingly and importantly, it was modeled on the Irish constabulary, which was armed and designed to quell potential uprisings, not to serve and protect like the Metropolitan Police in London. And that is what Guyana received. As in India, the British practiced the divide and conquer tactic of having British officers commanding ranks recruited from outside the populace sought to be controlled. In Guyana, the planters brought ex-slaves from Barbados to police the locally freed blacks. But quickly they decided they were not restive. They then defined the threat as coming from the Indian indenturers with their machetes or cutlasses on the sugar plantation. So we were targeted from them. We were, however, excluded from the Guyana police force, and this is the important fact that will come out of all of this, through what the British called minimum physical requirements. It would appear to be a facially neutral requirement, height and chest measurement, but Indians, when they arrived, were below the 5'8". We were about 5'2", 5'3", very, small boned. Chest measurements were not up to scratch, so we were effectively barred. Other social factors, such as the food they serve and the insistence on force, again, are mitigated against us. By the turn of the century, local Africans had filled its ranks, and these physical requirements continued into independence in Guyana in 1966. And by that time, Indian Guyana had become socialized to conclude that the police was not a profession for them. And this is what, when people blame the Indians for not wanting to enroll in the police, as they sometimes claim, they do not look at the historical roots that have formed such a feeling or such a perception. Well, starting from the bottom of the social ladder, because they were performing slave labor, by the end of the 19th century, the Girmitiyas were starting to move up the ranks through the creation of a rice industry, cattle, milk, and vegetable professions. But with their growing wealth and, as important, growing numbers, resentment against them from the African populace increased. This was especially true when, after the abolition of indentureship in 1920, two attempts were made by far-seeing Indian leaders to bring free Indians to the colony so they would constitute a supermajority, as in Mauritius, and not be challenged. But for reasons that only Gandhiji stopped that cold. So we remained at a very precarious level in Guyana. By the end of World War II, the Girmitiyas were entering the occupations previously close to them and were ready to engage politically with the advent of universal 1950. This created great resentment in what was called the colored or mixed populace. They were the descendants of African whites intermixing, but also the educated African stratum. They had expected to take over with the departure of the British. Mobilized Indian sugar workers to Chetty Jagan reach their old premises. Even though he declared he was a Marxist who saw race or ethnicity as false consciousness, Jagan yet cobbled together an ethnically balanced slate for the PPP, bringing in a popular young African lawyer, Forbes Burnham, to bring in urban Africans to compete in the 1953 elections on the universal franchise. The PPP won the elections, but Burnham, representing his group's antipathy against Indians and his own personal ambitions, insisted that he be leader. This infighting and the group's leftist slant caused the British to suspend the Constitution in 1953, and Burnham split the party in 1955. Effectively, politics was initiated at the mass level at this time, especially when Burnham lost the 1957 elections to Jagan, and he created his own party, the PNC, with Africans and mixed coloreds. So the country now was set on a path of ethnic politics. Between 1957 and 64, the PNC of Burnham waged a campaign to convince Africans that the PPP was only for Indians and against them. Ethnic politics was now solidified. The event that brought it to a head was the British signal that the group winning the 1961 elections would lead Guyana to independence. That the PPP could win this was presented in catastrophic terms for Africans. And in 1961 elections, which the PPP won, race became the dominant theme and was a very tense election. Well, to look behind what was going on, Jagan, the Marxist, was discovering what I have labeled the ethnic security dilemma, which is, even though Indians may constitute a majority, whether in number of seats in a first past the post, or an absolute majority in proportional representation, he was finding out that while such a majority could deliver office in democratic elections, it could not deliver power, because state power, the army, the police, and the bureaucracy were occupied by his African political opponents, and his hold on office would always be tenuous. He always had to consider At every act that he did, he had to anticipate the reaction from his quarters. The Africans, we must accept, have their own ethnic security dilemma because the Indians were closer to a majority in a first past the post system. Jagan guaranteed victory, and they said he would exclude Africans from power in perpetuity. The fact that Jagan insisted that he had all groups in his party didn't cut any ice. So I want to look at a little again behind, to go behind, not just to be descriptive, to look at what are the dynamics of ethnic politics, because this is what drives politics in each of the 17 countries to which we have been sent. And in those countries like Bangladesh and other places where we may be a minority, the Hindus may be a minority. It's a very similar dynamic. You see, in each of these countries where the Girmitiyas went, they found other groups there, either indigenous or imported as slaves for the plantation. In the West Indies, you had ex-slaves. In Fiji, you had Melanesians. In South Africa, you had blacks. In Mauritius, you had Creoles and so on. The constant in the equation was always the ruling whites who controlled the state and society through their laws, the forces at their disposal, and their hegemonic discursive structures already long deployed against us in India after the Macaulay Minute. With each group having different origins and modally different cultural heritages, they formed what the academics call ethnically plural societies. In such societies, and we have to remember this because there's a lot of confusion about this, the conflict is not about the ethnic or cultural differences per se. The conflict is fueled by political, economic, social, cultural, and territorial claims which trigger psychological fears that become very intense. Because these fears are embedded in the narratives of these groups. And to hear them speak, you will understand what motivates them. So the lesson out of this is that group power, group politics is always about real or perceived disparities in power between these groups. Very quickly, I would like to share with you some of the dynamics, again, behind that dynamic. That you started out with ethnic groups. And it's a sociological truism that groups placed in proximity will engage in a social comparison process. They'll compare with each other. Now, while we Girmitiyas were placed at the bottom of the ladder, we gradually moved up through sheer, hard, unremitting labor, facilitating the same culture that was derided because it gave us positive normative values. Over time, we move up from being the backward group to become the progressive, upwardly mobile one. And this, and the second part, after the group comparison, different groups evaluate the worth of themselves and their group. And what happens, groups always compare themselves relatively. Never mind, they also may have improved. They always compare themselves relatively. It's called relative deprivation. And what happens is that creates a lot of instability in them because you're not supposed to be that. You're supposed to be the underdog. How dare you now surpass us? That feeling gets very, very dangerous when it's combined, when those groups insist that they have a greater legitimacy to the national patrimony, to the wealth of the country, or whatever. And they claim that, for example, when they claim to be indigenous, as in South Africa or in Fiji, or like in Guyana and the other Girmitiya countries, that they came before, they were Christianized before, they were westernized before, they suffered more during slavery. And that it convinces them in their narrative, when you listen to it, that they have greater legitimacy, greater rights to this society. And we are mere sojourners. We shouldn't even be here, as you're hearing in South Africa. Why don't you go back to India? Now, in the decolonizing so-called democratizing wave after World War II. Those factors led to some of those groups practicing what they call the politics of entitlement. The politics of entitlement. And the motto of such politics is that what is ours, and what is yours is always negotiable. You got to fight for it because we are in control. And they could say that because they could trump our democratic majority and back up their claims through their strategic occupancy of the armed forces, such as in Fiji, Guyana, and Suriname. And this is critical. And this is critical. And we're seeing this today. You look at Bangladesh. That is the claim that they can count on those armed forces to back them up. Now, some leaders like Dr. Jagan, with his Marxist beliefs, predicted that this plural society would dissolve into some amorphous melange of class or national unity. But we have seen 60 years later that race, ethnicity has trumped class in every country, even in the so-called developed ones that were boasting about their being above all of this, England and America. So we, Girmitiyas and people of Indian origin, have to deal with this reality. We are living in an age of increasing identity politics, and we cannot afford to bury our heads in the sand. So those who say that race, ethnicity was constructed, it's not real, or it's an epiphenomenon, just blowing up, whistling in the dark. I will leave this for this portion, that when circumstances are perceived as real, they are real in their consequences. And these are the consequences we have faced in Fiji, South Africa presently, Guyana, and in Bangladesh, because the people have this in their head about their legitimacy and their right. Well, back to the history of Guyana, going back, because that's the topic we're supposed to talk in Guyana. Before 1950, between 57 and 1964, the PNC kept up this unrelenting drumbeat of the PPP being anti-national. And why? Because the Indians were skeptical of being swamped in a West Indies federation that were all dominated by African majorities. So they were being anti-national to worry about being overwhelmed. So the PNC also claimed, and this has become the pattern since that time, that the PPP discriminated against Africans by doling out the national patrimony, their national patrimony, to Indians in a rice development scheme. Never mind, they did not plant rice and did not apply for the scheme. Acquisitions that Indians were getting into the civil service, which was another one of their bailiwicks, also was another destabilizing factor and charge thrown. So I want to again go a step deeper, more granularly, to analyze the African response, not only in Guyana, but in each of these countries where we are facing violence, especially the Girmitiya countries. When you have unfulfilled expectations, when a group has unfulfilled expectations, like the Africans in Guyana, like the Melanesians in Fiji, like the blacks in South Africa, when you have unfulfilled expectation, it creates frustrations, and frustrations lead to anger. In Guyana, the African, as we said, have been socialized historically to look at us also as pagan sojourners, and now bombarded with unending claims that the Indians were taken over. Even Nobel Prize winning economist Sir Arthur Lewis said that the blacks were going to be exterminated. Listen to that phrase, exterminated. So that is what was created in the minds of Africans. Such anger, however, can peter out in resignation and violent protests, but also civil violence. And this depends to a great extent how their leaders interpret the interplay of two factors, which we should pay very, very close attention to these factors because it's present in all societies. This is the social control factor, which will inhibit violence, or social facilitation factors, which will encourage violent expressions. And look at this, especially what's going on in South Africa and Bangladesh today. With the retribution, a major factor in the likelihood of an aggrieved group choosing violence is whether there will be retribution. So in Guyana or Bangladesh or in South Africa, the members of the armed forces are seen as their kith and kin, and they perceive minimal reprisals against them. And so it has been. So the leadership also acts on the premise, and this again is about your leadership. They act on the premise that the leadership of the PPP, in addition to not possessing the capacity to use violence, do not even possess the will to do so. Burnham, the African leader, was always mocking about Cheddi Jagan claiming to share a Marxist position on society, and says, well, you're talking about racial discrimination. What is the socialist content of race? Mocking him. PNC leaders also have concluded down the decades that the PPP only responds to force and pressure. And why again? Because they expect no retribution. So what's the social facilitation factors? Apart from, well, they have a tradition of resisting through force, going back to slavery, where the national hero of Guyana is put up as Coffee, who fought against slavery, and good for him, but it has created a mindset of Americans that they must resist forcefully whatever when they are stymied. In addition to that, the other facilitating factor is the knowledge. When you have members of your group that can be mobilized into riots and looting and creating general mayhem, that group then is said to possess disruptive power. Disruptive power, and you're seeing it acting out even in West Bengal, because they feel they can always rise up against the other groups who are seen as passive. And in Guyana, the PNC was able to intimidate the PPP with that power base located in the capital, because it's not fortuitous that almost all the major riots in Georgetown have taken place in the predominantly African Georgetown. All studies show that individuals act differently in crowd. You have what is called that mob mentality than when alone. And the most effective cue to violence is when in that location there's a confrontation of the potential aggressor, in this case the Africans, with the source of their frustration, real or purported. In Guyana, Indian merchants of Regent Street, through the was demonized by African leaders since the 60s, have become a metaphor for Indian greed, of business, and inhumanity to Africans. So every riot you see Regent Street and its Indian businesses burnt, arson. In Guyana, when you have two groups that are almost of equal size, thanks to Gandhi and his stopping of indentureship, the PNC as the leaders of the African group, after weighing possible retribution versus the facilitation factors, they believe and have concluded that at any time they can seize power through violent confrontation. And we see this playing out right after the 1961 elections that was supposed to lead Guyana to independence. By then, Dr. Jagan, who John F. Kennedy concluded was a Marxist, and he was like Nehru, inspired from that direction, insisted that he be removed, and they found a willing conspirator in the African Party of Forbes Burnham and the PNC. We must note that the Indians never followed Jagan for ideological reasons. Indians were never and are never Marxist to that extent, at least in Guyana. But it was sentimental based on him being the first one to bring them into the political realm. So in the CIA-inspired riots of 1962, the ethnic-driven violence played out as African and Portuguese opposition to the PPP government burned and looted Indian businesses in the capital on February 16. We still call it Black Friday. The following year, there was another strike in which the riots spread from the capital into the countryside, and widespread violence was inflicted against Indians. In both these strikes, 1962 and 63, the police and the militia stood by while Indians were attacked. Once again, arson against our businesses in the city was rampant as ordinary Indians were beaten and molested. Now, people blame leaders for this, and leaders, of course, have a role to play in where they lead them. But that antipathy must already be there for leaders to whip it up. And this is why in Bangladesh, and we talk of what is going on now in South Africa, that antipathy is already there. And leaders call them wicked or call them what? Like in South Africa, you have this guy Malema, call him what? He is merely exploiting a sentiment that is already there to serve his own purposes. So we now segue into the 1964 riots, the emblematic riots for Guyana, which has, in a sense, formed a template for race relations in Guyana. The British and Americans by then had maneuvered Jagan into a corner. And Jagan, for whatever reasons, none of them make sense, allowed the British Secretary of State to alter the first past the post system which favored him and which was used in all of the colonies in the British Empire. And yet he gave the British the right to select what form. And they, of course, chose proportional representation, which the opponents were calling for and which favored them. Returning from London to Guyana, Jagan realized his strategic blunder, and he called a strike by his sugar worker union, Indians again. This led to widespread violence between Indians and Africans to pull Jagan's plum out of the fire. And it left a polarization between the races that remains stubbornly entrenched to this day. Eventually, in a very small country like Guyana, 176 persons would be killed, hundreds of mostly Indian houses torched, thousands assaulted and beaten. I would like to quote a bit extensively about, again, the emblematic event from that emblematic riot, which is called the Wismar ethnic cleansing. Some people call it the Wismar massacre. Now, this occurred in this remote bauxite town away from the coast where most Guyanese live. And it was predominantly African, 18,000 Africans to about less than 4,000 Indians. So allegedly reacting to the murder of an elderly African culture on the coast 60 miles away, the town erupted in what was described as an orgy of violence against the minority Indian population. And the date is critical, May 25th and 26th, 1964. I now quote directly from the official Commission of Inquiry appointed by the British government. I quote, "The local population, read African, in the majority supported these acts, whether they, the perpetrators, might have come from outside or wherever. They were certainly well informed about the precise location of East Indian premises in this area, and they were equipped and trained for incendiarism. The local population knew how to prevent fire. They prevented fire from save African homes, but they were unwilling to render any assistance to save Indian homes. They never lent a hand to extinguish fires here. And there were very few who offered shelter to the East Indians, and they were threatened to such an extent they had to put out the families whom they had succored. The majority of Africans, and I quote from an official report, the majority of Africans laughed and jeered at the East Indians as blood-stained and battered, raped and naked, shocked and destitute. They helplessly went their way to the only place of refuge, the Wisma police station. Importantly, African women played their part in these events to the fullest extent. Your commissioners are convinced that this was a diabolical plot, ingeniously planned and ruthlessly executed. We note their comment on the security forces because this still plays out in all these locales. On the day of the disturbances, there were 57 cases of assault, including rape, which were treated at the hospital. 2 persons were killed. All those houses were destroyed in addition to several cases of looting. Yet no member of the police or of the militia admit witnessing any case of rape, looting, or arson. They saw nothing. They saw no evil. However, a variety of allegations were made by witnesses against those same security forces. These included bribery, partaking in loot, standing by and refusing to give assistance, while rape and assault were committed, refusing to extinguish fires, supplying gasoline to arsonists, and by being politically partial by telling people who were beaten and stripped to go to your political leaders. Go to your political leaders. In the end, 3,399 Indians all had to flee. So to rub salt into that wound, Burnham won the next elections in 1964, December. And when he was granted independence in 1966 by the British, he chose May 26th for independence, the same day that the Indians had to flee Mackenzie, which they renamed after Burnham. It's called Linden today. They renamed it after Burnham, and he chose that day for Guyana independence. You can see the symbolic nature of what was going on, that they became independent when they ethnically cleansed this part of Guyana. 2 weeks later, a ferry transporting Africans back to the town exploded, and 43 Africans perished. The PPP has always been blamed for this, even though a commission of inquiry established by the British found inconclusive results. So Jagan was to remain out of office for 28 years as Burnham rigged every election after for 2 decades. After his initial objection, Burnham simply went along. And I want to put this into context when people blame Guyanese Indians for not reacting. They will say they're passive and they use all kinds of things. Because in addition to the police force being stacked against Indians, after Burnham took office and started rigging elections in 1968, he established what I have defined as a totalitarian dictatorship. Now, the word totalitarian might seem excessive. You know, it's associated with Hitler's Germany and Russia's, Stalin's Russia, but it is not really. By quantitative metrics, Guyana is not comparable, but qualitatively, in the meaning of totalitarianism in terms of total control over society and all institutions of society, it was the same. And it had the same stultifying effects on Indian opponents. What were these factors? First, there was a mass party that existed as a single party. Jagan's PPP, through rigging, was just there as window dressing to legitimize Burnham. He could never win an election because the elections were rigged. Yet he went to the polls, accepted that there was voting. So the world can say that, hey, several parties competed, but the elections are rigged. So you were simply, as I said, legitimizing Burnham, which he did. The Africans went along with the rigging because they felt it was their national patrimony, and they rejected the majoritarian premises of democracy because, after all, it was there. The PNC literally declared itself paramount over the state. You know, the party forms a government, and the government is under the state. The PNC party declared it was paramount over the state. And they laughed at Burnham because he never posed a real threat. When an African Guyanese leader in the late 70s did pose a threat, he was assassinated by the PNC in 1980. And that same year, Burnham passed a constitution giving him absolute power, quote unquote, legally. The second device was a system of terroristic control. In addition to having the army marching through the villages, there were goon squads formed by one Black American fugitive from justice, forming the House of Israel. There were bandits who kicked down doors and molested and beat Indians into a pulp. There were arbitrary search and seizures by the police. There were police informers in every locality. There were assassinations. And that was done to keep the pressure on the Indians. They responded to the pressure, native Indians, by mass migration. And every year from the 70s, the migration increased, and soon more than half of the Indians were abroad. And those who remained had to, in a sense, be part of the corruption to deal with the system. Absolute corruption was now power, and absolute corruption became absolute power, in which many Indians participated. The third device was that Burnham, like all dictatorships, he created a near monopoly over the mass communication and education to control what people thought. Their opposition newspapers weren't actually banned, but they couldn't get permission to import newsprint, so it was ineffective. The fourth one was, as we implied, but he built on it, the PNC had absolute control over the coercive apparatus of the state. He increased the police, created an all-African army by disbanding a unit that was racially balanced, and created new armed forces like the Guyana National Service and the People's Militia, all 90% African. And these were used, as I said, to intimidate Indian population. The fifth was to control the economy totally. Burnham nationalized 80% of the economy by 1976. And you had to be a supporter of his party to have a party card. And when you were fired, as Burnham said, you stay fired. So he controlled you through the economy. The sixth was even the civil organizations, NGOs, were all controlled. Trade unions, religious organizations, schools, cultural organizations. The Hindu organization called the Hindu Mahasabha was bought out, and they were literally paid a salary out of the PNC headquarters. And when you form new Hindu organizations, you were given no authority. For example, to marry Hindus through Hindu rites, you were not given a marriage license. And then, of course, there was the showpieces like Indians like Sir Sridhar Ramphal, who were placed in highly visible position, but essentially powerless to have any effect on change. And lastly, Burnham had an official Marxist ideology, which in essence checkmated Jagan, who claimed he was also Marxist. So what could he argue against a Marxist party? He then gave critical support to the PNC, and Indians were left at the mercies of whatever violence came their way. Now, after the change and fall of the Cold War, free and fair elections were brought into Guyana, and the PPP under Jagan, he was still alive, won in 1992. But he refused to alter the composition of the armed forces. I can speak of this personally because a group of us had assisted in his party being Indian in the 1992 elections. And I went and saw him, told him that at least create a platoon from Presidential Guard have them highly trained, possibly by the Israelis, so they can protect him and his government. He refused. He said, who would repair our seawalls? He was concerned about seawalls, not his political power. So lo and behold, as the Christians would say, the next election, 1997, Jagan had died by then. The PPP won again, but massive riots broke out in Georgetown, Guyana, by the PNC, who claimed the elections were rigged. Forget that the PPP Indians were a majority, and Indians were beaten in the streets of Guyana, especially Patak G was in Guyana at that time on 12th of January, 1998, when Indians were beaten in the streets of Georgetown like dogs with police standing by. I was working around the grassroots. We came from a camp, another part of the country, and I called for a commission of inquiry into this anti-Indian riots. And when it was denied, I formed then that ROAR, Rise, Organize, and Rally party to remind the PPP that it cannot take the Indian base for granted. We were not seeking political power. We simply had to remind them. And the banditry continued that year in 1998 to the extent, well, one magistrate called this guerrilla warfare against Indians. 31 Indian businessmen were assassinated in that year. And those murders continued through 99 into 2000. And the PPP was bludgeoned to the bargaining table. And very weakly, they gave away 2 years of the term of office and accepted constitutional change to govern more inclusively. But following the elections of 2001, which they won again, anti-Indian riots broke out again in Georgetown and widened this time to rural African strongholds. Those concessions of the PPP meant absolutely nothing because they had no one to turn to. They had no force to count on. And the African Guyanese Party knew there would be no retribution from the armed forces. On Republic Day, very symbolically, February 23rd, 2002, 5 prisoners were sprung from the country's main jail, and they announced they were African freedom fighters against the PPP. They ensconced themselves in an African village and mounted raids on neighboring Indian villages. They also launched an unprecedented wave of kidnappings, carjackings, robberies, and murders, primarily against Indians. These so-called freedom fighters took on the police directly, especially one unit which the government had persuaded to go after them. And that unit was checkmated. In one instance in 2008, 11 Indians were massacred at night while they were sleeping, including 5 children. You have to see the pictures which were on the front page of one of the dailies, with the guts of these children spewing out of their bellies. There were several other similar massacres before the bandits were wiped out. You see what went on here in wiping out the bandits. People have always tried to tiptoe around it because the African Guyanese claim that death squads were formed by the PPP just to go after them, and hundreds of African youths were killed. But I will quote a former PPP Prime Minister, Sam Hines, who's of African origin, and he explained what happened. He said, and I quote, "Following the 2002 jailbreak and their projection by key political factions as freedom fighters, the attacks on assumed supporters of the PNC were taken to a higher level. And when the national security forces showed a remarkable inability to apprehend them, it was inevitable that a similar irregular counterforce emerged." He was referring to the private and drug-related Phantom Squad that, along with bandits, turned Guyana into a killing field. So,
Mr. Dev, can you wrap up, please?
Yes.
We are running out of time.
I will conclude now that the fundamental dilemma is this. that an Indian-led government is unable to control the coercive apparatus of the state, they then make compromises by wooing members of the top brass of those institutions. And that further deprofessionalizes the forces. And this continues to today because the PPP refuses to confront the problem directly, either in fear of repercussions from those forces or being labeled racist. And this is the elephant in the room that must be removed because the existential threat to Indians continues through that principle of anticipated reaction. I thank you for being so patient.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Ravindra Dev, for a very painful and detailed, story of racism, racist violence, and targeted killings of a particular community in Guyana. I think most of people in the world, when they talk about racism, they have an only unidirectional notion of what racism constitutes. And I think there are different versions of racism depending on who controls the political power, who is the dominant ethnic majority. And there's a racism possible of all colors, all versions, all socioeconomic groups, and all religions. So we are witnessing in a country made of immigrants, a country in which all the ethnic groups are immigrants, one particular immigrant group labeling other immigrant group as not part of the nation and trying to exterminate that. And that is very unfortunate. And I'm very thankful that you gave painful details, and I'm pretty sure they might have been very painful as you were going through the dates. Because as a psychiatrist, I can see that there are lived memories while you were speaking. So I appreciate, but injustice has to be documented. We cannot shove it under the carpet. We have to talk about it, and we have to take corrective measures. And that is what the commission stands for. And we will continue to work with you. And we'll appreciate if there's a audio visual documentation, because we are in a different era at this point in time. Everybody has cell phones. So all these instances of injustice are fully documented, and we'll continue to work, bringing to the world what is going on in Guyana. We move on to question and answer sessions. I see there are two questions from Mr. Clemens, our executive director. Rather than reading his questions, I will invite him to speak the questions directly. Mr. Clemens. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. One of the questions I had, I remember when I was reading V.S. Nepal, he said, amongst the Indo-Caribbeans, he said that there was always the proselytizing eye of the local pastor upon the Hindu Indo-Caribbeans. I was wondering, to what extent, apart from race, to what extent did religion play a role in the discrimination against Indo-Caribbeans? I know you mentioned goon squads, was called House of Israel, for instance. It has religious overtones over there. Could you say something about that?
Well, the Christianizing imperative, was God following the British flag wherever they went. And Guyana was part and parcel of that. So the initial denigration of the Girmitiyas was through the Christian churches. We were pagan, we were heathen, we were dirty, we were filthy, we didn't speak properly. And when you, in a sense, we were othered into that which, or you're thrown out, you've scapegoated everything that is bad in you and place it on the Girmitiyas. So therefore, to inflict violence, it was not only appropriate, but was salutary to a certain extent. You're getting rid of these people. And if you read the literature, of the early 1920s as we saw them. So it was tremendous violence. And I'm not just talking about symbolic violence, as Gayatri Spivak talks about in terms of how they defined us. I'm talking about physical violence. As we said, the police could pick you up on the beach. And the church played its part in that because it never came to the aid of those. You had to be converted. And in fact, they were blamed for being recalcitrant. The actual immigrants from India, only a tiny percentage converted. And the conversion process only accelerated when the Indians entered the so-called educational system, moving from about 2% by the end of the internship to now it's almost 30% of the Indians are converted. So there is that hegemonizing apparatus of which the church plays part and parcel. In fact, today, right as we speak, there's an argument in the state that the educational system used what was called a universal prayer, which was not contributed to by any Hindu or Muslim organization, and the whole knowledge of a male god coming right after we celebrated Navratri, resonates, that they didn't see the irony of it, that it's a universal prayer. So that is going on right now. So yes, the church did play a great big role in that. And by the time it learned its lesson by the 70s, it was too late. Burnham, by that time, brought in the evangelical churches from the United States, including this fellow called the House of Israel. And they then took over from the mainstream Anglican and Catholic Church because they were much more virulently against paganism and other such practices. So right now, the dominant form of religion in Guyana is this evangelical movement, and they will go around uprooting your jhanda, your flag that we use in our communities to signal that we did a puja.
I will go on to the next question. It is from Dr. Kumar Mahabir, and I will paraphrase it. The question reads as follows. Having recognized that the Indo-Guyanese-led PPP government will do nothing to ethnically balance the armed forces, what choices are left to the ordinary Indo-Guyanese citizens?
Well, having lived in Guyana for the past 32 years and having attempted to bring it to the forefront when I entered Parliament and to be writing about this issue ad nauseum, where people start rolling their eyes when Ravindra Dev starts to speak about it, it has to be a larger movement because the emigration to metropole will continue. We are still seeing it happening even among COVID. Indo-Guyanese are leaving because the violence did not stop then. Last year, after the last election was won by the PPP, violence was fomented in one section of our country, and Indians were just again beaten and molested in that part of the country. And in fact, what I am proposing, and we will is to, after we have now gotten in touch with you, there have been calls for individuals to bring these, if the government of the day will not investigate them, to bring it to the attention of international bodies like yourself. One, to have some kind of inquiry into the beatings this last year. It's fresh. With the age of social media, we have many people have these things on their smartphones as to who scuffed somebody in the eye when the police stood by and saw Indian trucks of rice were being burnt. It's there. So if we could put together a group that could bring this to international attention, one. Another instance was when the PNC was rigging the last elections or attempting to, Indians rose up and started to protest. And one young Indian boy was shot by the police, extrajudicially was killed because his parents said he was not in any way fighting or being armed or anything like that. The ex-president of Guyana from the PPP wrote a letter to this effect, that there must be an inquest into this death of this boy who was killed by the police. No silence. Even the president of Guyana, former president, calling for it. A member of the PPP, a member of the central executive of the PPP. Nothing done. So there is also the need, going back to Kumar's question, I think that we cannot give up, as happened in Fiji or in Guyana, by fleeing. Fleeing, and I heard on a panel the other day that we are doing better in New Zealand or we're doing better in America or we're doing better. It's not the issue. The issue, we are fleeing, and it's a form of ethnic cleansing. You're having to flee your country like this. So I would suggest that it's another thing that maybe we can strategize and talk to you and get individuals to bring it to the world's attention.
I think that that's a very well taken suggestion, that it needs to be documented and brought to the attention of international bodies, including International Criminal Court for Justice in The Hague. I will go on to the next question. Does the present generation of Indo-Guyanese still have the physical disadvantage in joining the police or the armed forces? Are
No.
those
Absolutely not. After that first wave of indentures, better diets and what have you, we are now as tall or as large. And in fact, even way back in 1885, they recruited, the first batch was 25, large for that time, 1885, and they performed credibly. Therefore, it was a conscious exclusion. But in the Army, those are individuals of Indian descent who go into 10%. They perform very credibly, and in fact, they are some of the elite members of the Army are from the Indian community.
I think we have come to the end of Q&A session. I thank all our audience. I thank our speaker for bringing this very sad story of ethnic cleansing, cultural genocide, as well as physical genocide of a minority group. And very ironically, in a country made up of immigrants, where everyone is an immigrant, everyone has been brought by a white colonialist power, either in the form of slavery or in an alternative form of slavery called, indentured labor. And as I was saying, that there are different phases of racism. Racism is not necessarily white versus black racism. There are other forms of racism, and this is a living example of that other form of racism, where in certain situations, a minority has assumed dominant power, dominant social control, and is oppressing another ethnic minority. It is not unheard of, even in United States, whenever there is disturbance in urban centers, the shops and business establishments of Asians and Koreans are looted under the garb of protesting against police atrocities. So we are seeing this trend that no group is immune from racism, and those people who claim to be the victims of racism do become racist and use the same tactics to harm, to oppress other ethnic groups. We will appreciate if you continue to work with the Commission, constitute a working force, working task group that documents these atrocities on an ongoing basis and provides us with periodic reports so that we can bring it to the attention of the world. And again, I will thank all of our audience, as well as you, Mr. Dev, for bringing to our notice this very sad story of torture and ethnic cleansing of Indo-Guyanese in Guyana. With that last note, I will end this meeting, but our work is not done. We are always vigilant. We have to continue to work hard and deal with racism anywhere else. Thank you very much. Namaskar.
Thank you. Namaskar.